Hello, I'm Porschia Parker Griffin, and I want to welcome you to the Career 101 podcast, a place for ambitious professionals and seasoned executives who want an edge in their career. We're talking about all of the things you were never taught or told when it comes to career growth, development, and change. Now, let's get into it. Today, we are talking about business valuation with Mike Blake. Mike Blake is founder of High Score Strategies, a business and intangible asset valuation firm that helps its clients achieve winning outcomes from their strategic challenges and opportunities. A recovering venture capitalist and investment banker, Mike accomplishes this by empowering his clients with knowledge of the value of the assets they're acquiring, selling, licensing, or operating, which makes them superior decision makers. Mike's passion is helping people and organizations become better decision makers. In his non-professional time, Mike is a semi-professional rock musician, chess player, retro video game, and computer enthusiast, especially Atari consoles and computers from the 70s and 80s. Hi, Mike. How are you today?
I am fantastic, Portia. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Thank you for being here. I am really excited to have you with us to discuss business valuation. But first, we want to know a little more about you. So tell me about 7-year-old Mike.
So some would say 7-year-old Mike and 53-year-old Mike aren't all that different, at least emotionally and intellectually speaking. But 7-year-old Mike grew up in a town called Boxford, Massachusetts, which is about 25 miles north of Boston. At the time, the town was so small it didn't have a traffic light. You could make a local call by dialing 5 digits, and it was one of those places where you didn't lock your door. There was no need to do that. So I grew up in a fantastic environment. I played sports. I loved science. I loved, even back then, computers and technology, even though I didn't know that much about them because I was 7. But what I did know, I loved. And I wish I could give you this dramatic, tragic backstory as a kid, but it's about as boring as you could possibly imagine.
It doesn't sound boring. It sounds like you might have been on the Atari or something like that. So that sounds interesting to me. So what did you want to be when you grew up?
When I was that age, I wanted to be a meteorologist. I was fascinated by the weather. And one of the things I really loved and still love today is maps, right? So the meteorologists would come on and you get to see these really cool maps. And this was before you had Doppler radar. They were really just maps, like little drawings of the fronts and stuff. And you had satellite photos, and those were really the new thing back then. And it was so fascinating. So that got me interested in in weather and the fact you got to interact with maps, and that's what I wanted to do.
Very cool. I agree. I always thought watching the weather forecast and the maps and listening to the meteorologist, I thought that was super interesting too as a kid. I think it's still interesting now. Maybe that just means we're both nerds, Mike. Maybe
That's okay. The nerds are taking over, but
getting
I agree. And one of the neat things, I live in Portugal now. It's so interesting now to look at weather maps that are different. They're of Europe instead of the southeastern United States. I'm like, oh, I live here. This is relevant to me. So
Yeah,
again, a different way to geek out on weather maps.
I get it. And a whole new climate to further geek out on. Tell us about some highlights or pivotal moments in your career before you started your own business.
So my first job out of school was I was hired to run a USAID privatization and economic transformation program in Minsk, Belarus. And I was 23. I was a student at Northeastern University, had a full scholarship fellowship, and I was offered that job. Almost didn't take it, but then a friend of mine reminded me that in the years prior, I'd been studying Russian since high school, was always pretty good with languages. And at that time, of course, fall of the Berlin Wall, we thought that our relationship with Russia was going to be very different than what it's turned out to be, unfortunately. But at the time, a lot of hope. And my friend reminded me that was the job that I'd spent my entire life, or my entire semi-adult life, preparing for. So I dropped out of school and took that job, and basically was given a plane ticket and a phone number of a guy to call once I reached Minsk, who would be my partner when I was there. And I was the only American on the ground. I'm still stunned. I'm still stunned they hired me. My Russian wasn't all that good. Fortunately, I had some lead time. But we took that job, and I will say we took about over 4 years. We spent about $400,000 of USAID money, and we attracted about $30 million of private investment into Belarus and Ukraine. We actually got a pretty decent return on the investment for the American people.
Wow. Wow. That sounds really thrilling. And I would imagine for that being your first real job out of college, you've got the international, I guess, aspect to the position. You've got the whole political relations going on, to your point, and then just commerce going on. So there's so much to that experience. And it sounds like that kind of set you up for other opportunities in your career.
Yeah, I grew up a lot. I grew up, frankly, from a fairly privileged background. My parents did very well financially. And again, boring childhood, I wanted for nothing. And so when I landed in Minsk, none of that meant a darn thing, right? When I showed up, they gave me this piece of paper, and I had to look up what it was in the dictionary. It was a rationing card. They were still having food shortages. So as a new resident, and I was not living in a hotel, thankfully I was living in an apartment, but I had to find my own food. And there was a state limit to how much meat and how much flour and how much sugar I could buy. No limit on vodka, by the way. I wonder why that was. But anyway, there were limits to what I could buy. And ever since then, that taught me how to view crisis in a different way. And ever since, been fortunate to work with and lead and train some brilliant young professionals. And when something goes off the rails, as it inevitably does in business, despite your best efforts, and you get people that want to panic, I just say, come back to me when the government says you're limited in how much food you can buy, and then we'll talk about a crisis. And that's always been a great grounding point for me. And yeah, I learned so much in that experience. You talk about the international piece. It taught me empathy, force fed me empathy in a big way, because here was a country that had been our Cold War enemy. They lost the Cold War. They knew darn they lost the Cold War. But there are two ways you can treat victory, right? You can do a victory lap, and you can spike the football, right? And that makes the crowd feel good. Or you can extend a hand of sportsmanship to your adversary and tell them good game and embrace them to be better. And fortunately, probably by dumb luck, I don't think I had any exceptional wisdom, I chose that approach. And it was rammed home by the fact that the building in which I worked turned out that it was a bomb shelter. And so if you go into the staircase, as often I had to, because the elevator was often on the fritz, there were instructions on what to do in the case of a nuclear attack. And go down into the bomb shelter and put on your gas mask, your fallout equipment, and so forth. And I realized this is telling them what to do in case we launch a nuclear attack against them.
Yeah.
And I'll always remember that. I can still picture those images as clearly as I am looking at you across the camera today. I'll never forget that. And that was an ongoing lesson to me about thinking about how the other person thinks, feels, reacts. And that's served me very well in my career.
Yeah, I'm sure. And thank you for sharing that, because I think it all touches on what you were mentioning earlier about empathy. I actually was in Europe around that time too. We moved to Germany in 1989, right after the Berlin Wall came down. And I was very young at that point, but I do still remember just being an American in Europe at that time. So, Mike, what motivated you to start your business?
What motivated me to start my business is I've discovered over the years that I'm not a very good employee. It's very possible I might be even a worse business partner. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a tie, but I have learned that I don't think in conventional business terms. And by the way, I don't say that with an iota of superiority. There are businesses that are more successful. Most of them are more successful than mine, but they wouldn't be successful for me. I'm always thinking about the long term, maybe to a fall. I'm always tinkering. I'm always experimenting. I see business as much as anything as a platform to do social good as it is to deliver value to a client. And those two things to me have to align or I quickly lose motivation. I see a business as a blank canvas. It's a creative outlet for me. And how can I improve upon what I do? How can I push my profession to improve what it does? How can I raise the standing of our profession within the general public? And many times that drives people crazy. I'll share with you this. I still have a performance review I received from not long ago. It was at a firm where I was up for partner, didn't make it, never was going to make it. But my last performance review before I left said, Mike is a team player, probably too much of one, and to his personal detriment. And I realized this cannot possibly be for me. I need to have an environment where the team is first. And I fully admit I may be the naive one. I'm the naive one that doesn't do the politics and doesn't do the ring kissing and everything else. I just do what I think is right and what brings me joy, as hedonistic as that sounds. And for good or ill, in most of the corporate world, what I want is incompatible with what a lot of employers see as valuable and even tolerable. And that's okay. So starting my own business gives me the platform to do that. When I do things differently, nobody's hurt other than myself. And it takes for me, it's actually less risky and it's less stressful than being an employee.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that a lot of people have thoughts about entrepreneurship, pursuing it or not pursuing it, what it means to do that. And they think that all entrepreneurs have to be a certain way. And that isn't true, right? When you go out in businesses, and I'm sure with the consulting you do, businesses and business owners who operate in a lot of different ways. To your point about being a team player, I think it is great that you touched on that. We actually have an episode, I think it was episode 5, back on teamwork. And we really dove into what does it mean to be a team player and touched on that. So we got into a little bit of what you were talking about there. So Mike, why did you decide to focus on business valuation as part of your expertise in your own business?
So this is going to sound glib, but it's not intended to be. It's just the way things work out. God has a sense of humor. I knew I wanted to be in finance, and I started off in venture capital, loved it, and in particular worked for a venture capital fund that focused on taking military technologies and converting them to civilian applications. So I worked for a venture fund that actually took facilities that were developing biological, chemical, nuclear weapons or their delivery systems, design systems in Russia, and converting them to a civilian purpose. For example, we took an anthrax production facility and turned it into an AIDS testing kit company for the Russian market, as an example. I liked it, but I wasn't very good at it. And I wasn't very good at it because at that age, in my mid-20s, I just wanted to say yes to everybody. And saying yes to everybody in venture capital makes you popular and poor, not necessarily in that order, and very quickly. And then moved into investment banking, which I was also good at because I'm good at crunching numbers. I work hard enough. I learned enough in VC to understand deal making. The problem is I didn't like it. It was, and this is nothing against investment bankers, by the way. Investment bankers serve a vital, critical function in our economy. And people who think that investment bankers don't earn the money that they make ought to try being an investment banker for 6 months and come back to me and see if you think they don't earn it. Um, but I don't do well in an environment where I get paid only if the client achieves one outcome, okay, which is selling the business, right? And what if it's not in the client's best interest to sell the business? And the answer is, don't worry about it. And I did worry about it. And there's an emotional dissonance there that I could not fully reconcile. After a failed abortive attempt at a PhD at Georgia Tech, where I lasted about as long as the Chevy Chase talk show, I bounced around doing some contract work for a while. And then my wife, without my knowledge, applied for a business valuation job with a boutique firm in Atlantis. They called me, asking for an interview, and I almost hung up on them because I wasn't expecting it. I thought it was a cold call. They were trying to get me in a multi-level marketing pyramid scheme or something for Herbalife. I didn't know. But I didn't hang up on them. And I said, called my wife, saying, the funniest thing happened is people just offered me a job out of the blue. I said, oh, I'm so glad they contacted you. Anyway, that's when I found out that she applied. And I initially resisted it because I told you that my parents did very well financially. My father did very well financially, principally because he ran the business valuation practice for Ernst & Young North America for about 20 years. And his valuation clients were AIG, Enron, the New England Patriots, among others, or actually National Football League. Is either the NFL or the New England Patriots? I forget which one, but you get the idea. And you can take this as kid bragging about his dad, or you can take it as an attempt to be analytical. But he was the LeBron James of the business valuation profession, in my view. He wiped out people in court and expert testimony. I can't tell you how many careers he likely ended because of how roundly he defeated people in court. He was that good. And I'm like, how do I compare to this? And I'm all, at best going to be seen as my dad's kid. Excuse me. So I resisted that for the longest time. But I discovered over time, the only thing that I'm good at, that I can make a decent living at, that is legal. And so I fell into business valuation. I took a flyer on it. And it turned out that I could carve out a little niche for myself, whereas my dad, again, did global companies, multi-billion-dollar cases. That's not my bailiwick. My dad looks great in a $3,000 suit, still does. I look like an idiot in a $3,000 suit. I might as well be barefoot. It just looks uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to see me in one. But in the space where I play, which is companies up to about $50, $100 million, that's where I relate to people. That's where I seem to be able to bring enough value. So over time, I learned that there are real people, just like I worked with in Minsk and Kiev, that I could use my finance skills to be hands-on and to make a real difference in people's lives. And so I got into that line of work almost 20 years ago and still going strong.
That's great. That's great. You said a lot there about your father, and I've heard from a lot of our clients about choosing careers or not choosing careers because they didn't want to feel like they were in a parent's shadow. So it's great that you were able to carve out your own niche within business valuation. But for those who don't know, what is business valuation?
So business valuation is figuring out the value of a business, or in a parallel line of work, intangible assets or intellectual property. So most of us are familiar with real estate appraisers. I do the same thing as a real estate appraiser, but I do it for businesses and intangible assets.
So when would a business owner or an executive team need a business valuation? The Career 101 podcast is brought to you by Fly High Coaching, where we help our clients soar to their full potential. More and more professionals and executives are setting out to achieve their career goals. But without the right support, it can be difficult, if not impossible. Whether you need career coaching, interview coaching, or a professional resume, we're here to help. Check us out on our website, fly-highcoaching.com.
So we could take up the entire podcast with a list or thing, but we're not going to do that because that's not fair to the internet, or general reasons why. One is there's a transaction. You're going to buy a business, sell your business. You'd never sell your house without getting it appraised. You wouldn't buy one. Same thing with a business. And that's where I do a lot of my work. Also, when somebody's going to raise money for their business or invest in a business, valuation comes into play there too. We help clients with that. There's another group of valuation needs that I do some of, not as much, in compliance. There are certain tax events that require a valuation. Usually the transfer of an estate or gifting a business to another generation, something like that. That requires a valuation under US law. There are certain accounting requirements for valuation. You might have heard of fair value accounting. It's people like me that make that go. We tell the accountants what number they should put on their balance sheet of the income statement, depending on the assignment. And then the final grouping is dispute resolution, which I don't do personally. My dad did and was like I said, was excellent at it. And what that means in English is that in a civil case where you're fighting over the value of shares or business damage or something like that, the lawyer's job is to argue to the court who broke the law. And the expert's job, somebody like me, has the job of telling the court what the number ought to be. So transactions, taxes, accounting, litigation, disputes. Those are generally the four kind of categories of reasons that somebody would reach out to somebody like me for help.
Right. So I find that many entrepreneurs and executives have different ideas about how to value a business. From your perspective, what are some of the best ways to estimate the value of a business?
Yeah, it's funny. One thing I say about our profession is we're a genius if our value conclusion is roughly what the client thought it was going to be, and we're a moron if it's materially different. And that's just the nature of what of the profession we've chosen. But to my mind, there is no best methodology. The best methodology is the one that's best supported by the data. And in some cases, there are businesses where, take restaurants, for example, there are tons of restaurant transactions all over the place. It's very easy to determine the value of a restaurant because you can find comparable restaurants all over the place. On the other hand, take a startup data analytics company with no track record, right? That it may be difficult to find comparable companies. And therefore you have to rely on something that's more aligned with cash flow, or you can't rely on purchases of companies, but you have to rely on data involving venture capital investments in those kinds of companies because that's how the market works. Or maybe there's a company that's failing and you wouldn't use either of those two, but rather you'd figure out, well, what's the value of its assets? If you're just going to sell it off piecemeal, we call that liquidation value. So there is no one single methodology, at least in my mind. What I tell people is I go where the data takes me, and wherever I find the data is the most reliable, abundant, credible, that's where I'm going to go. And if I'm really lucky, there's enough data where it enables me to use multiple methodologies. And the hope is that they all more or less point in the same direction. That's what gives me the opportunity to do my happy dance.
So, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen entrepreneurs and leaders have with business valuation?
I think what entrepreneurs struggle with business valuation is they're not quite sure what to do with it. And they know they need a valuation. And they often have the misconception that if they put a valuation on the table in front of an investor, that the investor goes, oh, that's what this guy says the business is worth. So I guess I better make that investment at that valuation. And that's absolutely not the case. In fact, I tell clients all the time, doing that will lessen your chance of an investment, not increase it. An investor, unless they've hired me, an investor has no interest at all and what I think their business is worth, unless I'm prepared to write a check as a lead investor, right? Then they're interested. But if I have no skin in the game like that, they're not interested. Um, I think on the executive side, the biggest challenge is they often realize they need a valuation too late. They've either committed an action, for example, they've granted shares to an employee and decided after they grant the shares, now I want to know what the value of the shares is. That's great, right? But it would have been much more useful to you had you known in advance. You could have planned what that looks like. Or if it's the case of a client that wants to buy the business, they'll call me and say, I want to close on buying this business in a week. Can you do an appraisal? I'll say, nope. You either got to push back the appraisal or you got to do something else. The close, you got to do something else because I cannot do a good, even if I had nothing else going on. And I haven't had nothing else going on in about 20 years. Even had nothing else going on, I couldn't do that in a week and do a good job. Right. And the most difficult part is somebody that needs to sell their business. They've been hopping along and maybe they're calm in their 60s and then they get some bad health news and they realize they're not going to be able to continue with the business in some fashion. They got to sell within a year, but their business is not all that attractive right now. Whereas had they spoken to me 3 years ago, 5 years ago, I could have helped them put programs in place that would have made their business quite valuable. But again, it's the timing. When they wait too long to call me, my intellectual capital very much gets sidelined and my opportunities to help them are quite limited.
Yeah. Waiting too late is definitely a major challenge, I think, in business in a lot of ways. And I could definitely see how it can cause the major issues by issuing stock or things like that before knowing the real value. So tell us more about high score strategies.
Yeah. So my wife and I own this firm. We set it up last year and it was the vehicle for us to move to Portugal and to be independent. So as you said in my bio, I love video games. I'm from the Atari generation. Behind me here, you can see an old Atari 1040 16-bit computer, one of the jewels of my collection. And back when I lived in Atlanta, I used to have arcade games in my background and everybody would love them. Yeah, everybody, when they first saw them, had a smile on their face. And they all had some memory of playing Pac-Man or Dig Dug or Ms. Pac-Man, whatever. And it brought back a memory. And I just love the joy that it gave them. I don't have new arcade games yet. We couldn't move them to Portugal. It's prohibitively expensive. They wouldn't work on the electrical current anyway. But I did want to put that into our name because I think everybody, whatever they do, they want a strategy to achieve a high score. And so what we do is we use valuation as the starting point to help our clients achieve the highest score they can in whatever strategy game they're playing.
I love that. I love that. We can tell that you obviously do that through business valuation, but what are some other ways that you help your client?
One thing I'm helping my clients a lot with now, and this is by accident, is helping clients plan how to commercialize their intellectual property. A lot of companies have IP lying around. They've got patents, data, trade secrets, software that they've developed, but they don't know how to monetize. And it occurred to me, and this is what I was doing very early in my career, both with USAID and later on in venture capital. I was all about that. And I stumbled on the fact that there's a great need for people who need advice on how to get hold of their intellectual property and turn it into a productive asset for them. So by accident, that's turning into a nice little consulting business for us.
So we'll be providing a link to your website and other social channels in our show notes so people can find you online. But what is the best way for someone to get in touch with you?
So I'm not hard to find as I'm probably discerned over the internet. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Unblakeable, Facebook at Unblakeable, Twitter, Threads, X, the site formerly known as Twitter, at Unbreakable, Instagram at Unbreakable. We have a YouTube channel now called Your Business Value. Interestingly enough, it used to be called High Score Strategies, but YouTube killed it because it sounded too much like a video game channel. They wiped their channel out. And you'll find me through any of those channels. And if all else fails, mblake@highscorestrategies.com is the email address.
Great. Mike, I want to ask you our final question that we ask all of our guests. How do you think executives or professionals can get a positive edge in their career or with their business?
Yeah, this is, to me, I think it's a very clear answer, is leverage social media to build a social media brand. And a lot of people shy away from social media. So, well, I can't write, or everything's already been talked about. And it reminds me of somebody in 1895 who said that there's nothing more to patent because everything had been invented. But it's so easy to build a brand for yourself, be known for something. Even if you're a first-time job seeker, show people that you can write, show people that you're curious about the field that you're in, show people that you care enough that even when you're not being paid, you think about that field and how to make it better, how to contribute to it. And there's so much opportunity out there for social media. I understand social media can be a highly destructive and cynical force. I get it, but it does not have to be. Rise above it, make your voice heard. There's always room for another voice.
Great, great. Mike, you've shared a lot of insights with us today, and I'm sure that our listeners can use it to be more confident with their businesses. We appreciate you being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a fun conversation.
This episode was brought to you by the Bravebird Career Alliance, the go-to membership designed for seasoned executives and ambitious professionals with everything you need for career planning, strategy, training, and support. Thank you again for listening to the Career 101 podcast. I hope you have at least one key takeaway that you can use in your own career. If you enjoyed hanging out with us, please rate, subscribe, and share this podcast. Until next time, here's to your success.